This is going to be a juicy video around the post-activation potentiation potential lies. Now, as a coach, I'm always on top of the latest research in sports performance. I break down the latest research in the Science for Sport Performance Digest every month. Been doing that for almost 10 years now, or actually 7 or 8 years. And post-activation potentiation, or PAP, is a buzz that's always being published within various journals. Now, if you're unaware of post-activation potentiation, or PAP, it's a popular method used to enhance explosive movements in athletes, and I'll go into a little more detail in a second. But if we're going to use the correct terminology, it's actually post-activation performance enhancement, or PAPE, P-A-P-E, instead of P-A-P. Since PAP refers to an enhanced twitch rate through electrical stimulation. So essentially one is twitching, the other is actual outputs during a athletic movement. This means vertical jump, sprinting, ballistic exercises, etc. Throughout this video, we're going to refer to it as PAPE, P-A-P-E, instead of PAP, just for any of the exercise physiologists and sports scientists that decide they want to have an issue with that. Regardless, we're talking about enhancing athletic performance. And what if I told you that recent studies, as in this month, suggest PAPE might be a lie? So to give you context on post-activation performance enhancement, it's a method where you lift something heavy and that quote unquote primes the muscles and the nervous system will produce more power in subsequent exercises. A really easy example that you probably know, heavy squat followed by a box jump. That would be a typical post-activation potentiation, or PAPE, exercise complex. Here's the twist. New research is showing that the performance benefits attributed to PAPE might be the result of a good warm-up. So it might not be the fact that you're doing these heavy lifts and that is potentiating the athletic movement. It's maybe the fact that that heavy lift is warming you up better than what was done in the control group. Now, does this influence the way I program going forward and how you should train? And I'll break that down in this video with the latest research around PAPE and explore whether PAPE is a myth, and more importantly, if post-activation performance enhancement is a still worthwhile training protocol. By the end, you'll know exactly what you need to do in your warm-ups to perform at your peak. But before getting started, you will find the free MMA strength conditioning blueprint and the new free BJJ strength conditioning blueprint down in the description. That'll be the first 2 links. I'll put them in the comments as well. They're free, they cover everything to do with strength and conditioning for MMA and Jiu-Jitsu, so make sure you check those out. But when we talk about PAPE, one of the best papers that I've come across is from Greg Huff and Seats in 2016. I had Gregory Huff on the podcast a little while ago now, so make sure you check that out as well, because he talks a lot about this and other concepts. He's published countless papers, not just on post-activation performance enhancement, but various other sports science topics. And this review and meta-analysis summed up the totality of research to identify which factors influenced post-activation performance enhancement. And the PAPE effect is small for jumping, throwing, and upper body ballistic performance, so that would be throws, bench throws, etc., and is moderate for sprint performance. So basically you get a stronger effect for sprinting than you do for these other activities. They then detail the varying factors around strength status, conditioning activity, which is the activity used before the explosive movement. They then detail the varying factors around strength status, conditioning activity, which is the activity used before the explosive movement, recovery time, etc. But I'm not going to go into those because that's not important for this video. What's important is seeing how these protocols compare to just a general warm-up. And unfortunately, many of the studies in this review don't compare to a control group, but within the different protocols. So they're looking at things like what recovery time gives you the best response in performance. For example, both groups will do the squat, they'll do their PAPE activity at 1, 3, 5, 7 minutes, etc., to see which one is a strongest response. Some of the papers that were in this meta-analysis, some that weren't as well, some that I have off the top of my head in this space, because I've looked a lot into this research before, to give you an idea of the methods used, and then you can decide for yourself whether you think it is a warm-up benefit or an actual post-activation performance enhancement. I'm also going to help you down that road too as well as we get through this. But the first one's by Dan Baker in 2003. If you don't know Dan Baker, a lead strength conditioning coach in the National Rugby League in Australia. He was with the Brisbane Broncos for a very, very long time. Pretty much pioneered maximal aerobic speed training in team sports, I would say, based on his PDF, but regardless, He had subjects perform 5 reps of both the bench press and the bench throw. So bench throw, lying down on the Smith machine, throwing it as hard as you can. Bench press with 60 kgs and bench throw with 40 kgs. That was the warm up for everyone in this study. After a 4-minute rest, the subjects performed the pre-test. So this will be the test to see if there's going to be any difference after whatever happens. So the pre-test consisted of 5 consecutive reps of the bench throw with 50 kilos. And then after 3 more minutes rest, the control group repeated the test. So essentially the control group, 60 kg bench press with 5 reps. They did 5 bench throws with 40 kilos, 5 bench throws with 50 kilos, and then just repeated that. Whereas the intervention group, instead of after their first set of bench throws to 50 kilos, they performed 6 reps of bench press with 65% of their 1RM. Now in this study, that group that performed the extra bench press sets were able to potentiate their bench throw more than the control group. Now, was it the extra work of being able to lift something a little heavier than what they were throwing that created a better warm-up stimulus so they could throw that barbell harder, faster? I don't know. But it seems to be potentially that could be the case, since the control group, all they did was throw that 50 kilo test weight. They didn't get to go above that. Whereas the post-activation performance enhancement group, they got to lift a heavier load, potentially stimulating more warm-up. Again, that line is very blurred, as you can see, between what is actually PAPE and what is a warm-up. We have a study here by Loisis and his colleagues in 2013. They had subjects complete a warm-up protocol lasting 5 minutes, consisting of low intensity jogging. You'll find that a pretty common theme within most studies, where it's 5 minutes of some kind of low intensity activity, followed by 4 sets of submaximal bench press at 30 to 50% 1RM, with 1.5 minutes rest between sets. And then they were doing 30% 1RM bench throws as the test. So as you can see there, that warm up is average, but the point was not to compare to the control, it was comparing experimental groups. So the experimental groups, they had 4 of them, 65 or 85% 1RM bench presses with 4 or 8 minutes rest in between. But regardless, they were comparing loads and rest times and showing that moderate loads need less rest and heavier loads need more rest for enhancing power. Now there's one study that showed no PAPE response, and that's by Smith and his colleagues in 2014. They had subjects perform 4 minutes of cycling at 70 RPM at a self-selected resistance. Then they performed, after 4 minutes rest, they performed a 40-yard sprint, rested 4 minutes, and then they either performed the control, which was a 20-yard sprint with no load, or a 10, 20, or 30% body mass 20-yard sprint. And then they had 4 minutes rest and they repeated that 40-yard sprint. So the 40-yard sprint was the test to see if there was going to be a change. And they found that there wasn't much difference in 40-yard sprint performance, regardless of the condition. Now, potentially, that 40-yard sprint and that 20-yard sprint was enough to potentiate, regardless of load, the next 40-yard sprint, because you're already onto your 3rd maximal effort. That's kind of how I perceive that paper. But I think this is the paper, or my favorite paper, that personifies this idea of warm-up versus a PAPE protocol. And it's the first one that came to mind when I read the new paper that came out this month. This was like instantly in my head, because I remember reading the study and being like, this doesn't actually tell us what it's trying to tell us. So this study was in golf, and they were measuring club head speed. And it's by Reed and colleagues in 2013. They had an experimental group and a control group. Both groups performed a 10-minute standardized warm-up. And this was just dynamic stretching, followed by 3 practice shots. So you can imagine doing 10 minutes of dynamic stretching and then just doing 3 golf swings, how not warm you would be feeling to hit the ball as far as you can. So after that warm up, they measured club head speed, taking an average score of 3 shots, separated by 60 seconds. So that was the control group. They did their 3 practice shots, and then 60 seconds later, they hit 3 balls. The experimental group though, they performed 3 vertical jumps before the first shot. So essentially you're actually getting a decent warm up before you hit the ball. And obviously they conclude that the vertical jump condition increased club head speed more than the control condition, meaning that can be a useful PAPE activity to do to enhance golf performance. I would agree it would be useful, but I wouldn't put it down to being a PAPE response, because it was just a better warm up than doing just dynamic stretches. Which brings me to the brand new study that was published this month by Rappelt. And they performed 3 studies in one using 3 different conditioning activities. So this is pretty comprehensive. It's not just one protocol and then making conclusions. They used 3 different protocols based on the previous research, but they used a more intense warm-up than any other PAPE paper has done, that I've seen at least. And they essentially did 5 minutes of cycling at 80 RPM, but the resistance was set at 150% of body mass. So they had quite a bit of resistance on it. 80 RPM is relatively quick. If you've been on a bike before and maybe you're doing even just rehab work, you're typically instructed to cycle between 70 and 80 RPM just for general rehab stuff. It's enough definitely to get a sweat going, and when you're adding that kind of resistance on it, it becomes even harder. So that was the general warm-up. So all 3 studies in this one study all performed that same general warm-up. After their general warm-ups, they all performed their specific warm-ups for their tasks, but they did the PAPE activity. So I guess you could say they did the vertical jumps that they're measuring after the general warm-up as well. So before the general warm-up, after the general warm-up, after the specific warm-up, and then after the actual activities. So this way you can get an idea of, is that general warm-up enough to improve performance in that jump? Is doing the specific warm-up going to make the jump go higher? Then is the actual conditioning activity or the experimental conditioning going to make the jump go even higher? Because if it did, then we could conclude that, hey, this probably has legs. So study 1, they looked at isometrics. So submaximal isometrics, 65% 1RM on the back, holding it for 6 seconds with their knees slightly bent, versus a supramaximal, which was 130% 1RM, holding for 3 seconds with the knees slightly bent. The second study used EMS, which is electrical stimulation. If you remember when Mike Tyson was making a comeback to fight Jake Paul, and there was that video circling of him, I think, doing medicine ball slams with a whole lot of wires attached to him, it's that. And they did that essentially a 3 sets of 10-second isometric squats in the parallel position with the EMS at 85% of their, I guess, maximal strength they could handle without it being too painful, versus a 3 sets of 3 squat with 85% 1RM. And then the third study looked at upper body versus lower body to potentiate jumps. So seated chest press, 4 reps of 80% 1RM versus 4 sets of 80% 1RM squats. And in all 3 studies, there was no difference in counter movement jump seen after the general warm-up. So essentially, pre to post general warm-up, they found a trivial or small increase in jump height. And then after that, there's no significant change regardless of specific warm-up or the actual conditioning activities they used. So they conclude that it indicates that with an adequate warm-up, high-load conditioning activities may not present a PAPE effect, and studies that demonstrate strong PAPE effects may not have intense enough warm-ups. And to me, this is a pretty damning study against PAPE and shows how the line can be blurred so closely between warm-ups and conditioning activities. You know, what still counts as a warm-up and what counts as a PAP or PAP response in a complex. But that's just getting into the terminology. What you probably want to know is how this affects you, or if it does at all, and what it changes for my programming for you as well. And with all this evidence, I still won't be ditching PAPE. And what do I mean by that? And why am I not changing my methods when presented with this evidence? Now, PAPE is typically performed in a complex or contrast. So you're essentially pairing heavy and light loads, as my previous example, squats and jumps. And regardless of a PAPE response, it's a useful programming setup, mainly due to time. If you have 3 sets of jumps and then 3 working sets of squats as an example, you can pair them together to save time. Squat, rest, jump, rest, squat, rest, etc. Versus performing them standalone. Now, there's nothing wrong with performing them standalone. I often program it like that when you're programming fast movements to slower movements, but complexing is definitely a way to save time and a way to speed up that warm-up. So you don't have to warm up to do the jumps as much versus warming up just to be able to, say, squat heavier, because you can get under the bar and start working and you can get to your top sets pretty quick. And that's gonna warm you up faster than maybe doing 3 or 5 minutes of, let's say dynamic stretching, and then maybe you're jumping some rope, and then you're maybe doing a mobility circuit. That's gonna take you a while. Versus maybe doing some very quick general warm-up before getting under the bar, doing your squats, doing some submaximal jumps, and you've completed that complex in 10 minutes, for example. Further, whether it's a PAPE effect or not, the feeling of being quote unquote really warmed up from a heavy lift will improve ballistic performance compared to going in not quite primed. And I think a lot of you potentially have felt that before. If you are doing, say, plyometrics or jumps or throws even at the beginning of your session, versus say after a heavy lift or near the end of the session, you feel much more ready to be able to express maximal intent. Now, you can also use the concept of an over warm-up set. And if we go back to the first paper I mentioned by Dan Baker, where they did that 65% 1RM bench press for the throws, that would be a pretty simple example of an over warm-up set. I think you can take it further. It's one of my favorite methods of programming strength work. And you'll see it throughout my year-long 365 training programs in the Sweet Science of Fighting Underground, especially with the grapplers in there. And it's pretty easy to implement and doesn't take much time. So essentially, if you have, say, 3 sets of 5 working sets at 70% 1RM on the squat, instead of performing warm-up sets to 60% 1RM, so you may go like bar, let's just say 50% 1RM for 5 reps, 60% for 3 reps, then you're into your working sets. You can continue going up to say 85, 90% 1RM for a single. So you could do 50%, then 60% for 3, then you could even touch 70% or 75, and you could just do singles from here. 1 or 2 reps at 70%, 1 rep at 80%, and then 1 rep at like 85, 90%. Then you drop back down to your working weights, making it feel easier and lighter. Plus you get some of that high end work as well. You kind of touch that. It's a concept around hitting a daily like easy max. So if you've heard an everyday max before, similar concept, but you don't need to do it every day and you don't need to go to that level. You can kind of sit under that. So in the 80 to 90% range is pretty good. You only have to do a single or so. You feel that heavy weight in your hands or on your back, and that helps make your working sets feel lighter. So while PAPE may not be a real response, don't know fully yet, but the evidence seems to be stacking against it, the principles of PAPE should still remain within your training. At least that's what I believe, and that's what I'll be continuing to do because of the reasons that I just mentioned. But make sure you go down in the description, pick up the MMA and BJJ strength and conditioning blueprints. They are free, and I'll see you in the next video.